we have essentially a zero vacancy rate at this point. Like it's
in St. Catharines.
In St. Catharines. The reality is that both levels of government really weren't coming to the table on this issue.
Today we are sitting down with Mayor of St. Catharines, Mayor Siscoe, Mayor Mat Siscoe. Canadian citizens needing homes versus immigrants and refugees.
If you're going to bring 500,000 or 1 million immigrants into Canada, the question has to be asked, where are they going to live? Dealing with a refugee crisis in Niagara Falls, we were trying to deal with the drug crisis. You know, a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, they got to get themselves clean. These are the folks who've been homeless the longest. Just keeping them alive, you're only doing half the job. You've got to help people. We were seeing the actual effects on the ground of what the housing crisis looked like, start seeing units built.
I want to understand that a little bit more. Simplify for my generation. Welcome to My Generation. Today we are sitting down with Mayor of St. Catharines, Mayor Siscoe, Mayor Mat Siscoe. Thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
How can I reference you properly in this episode?
Your worship is fine.
I love that.
No, people ask me that question all the time. Truthfully, for the purposes of this, you can call me Matt if you're not comfortable with that, Mr. Mayor.
I like Matt.
Matt works.
But it's Matt with one T.
Yes.
Why?
My mom thought, she told me this story. My mom thought that if she spelled my name with one T, people wouldn't call me Matt, they would call me Matthew. I have no idea why that thought occurred to her.
The Matt still comes to me,
It doesn't make any sense at all to me, and I laugh at her on a regular basis. She was never, my first city council election in 2010, I put Matthew Siscoe on my election sign because I thought I had to have my official name on the ballot.
Right.
And then I got elected and they're like, oh, you don't need that. So when I ran provincially in 2014, I switched to Mat Siscoe. And my mom said nothing disappointed her more in my political career. My political career, she was so happy when she saw Matthew, and ever since then.
Well, I love that. We'll go by Matt today if that's cool with you. So, of course, I want to talk about housing with you. And I think municipalities have been given an intense responsibility in the last, especially year, 2 years, to build more homes. And we were talking about this off camera, but I wanted to ask you what support looked like before the Housing Accelerator Fund, which was, of course, a $4 plus now billion fund to help municipalities build, where the federal government's reaching down to municipalities and offering funding to ambitious plans. What did funding from the provincial and federal government look like before the HAF came into play? So
I'm going to answer this question first by not answering it, and I will say that since the province and the feds have sort of opened up the pocketbooks, the support's been really phenomenal, and I appreciate, you know, what we're getting from Minister Calandra at the provincial level, Minister Fraser at the federal level. It's been phenomenal. Previous to that, so we'll go, you know, pre-2022, the reality is that both levels of government really weren't coming to the table on this issue.
Were there discussions of any kind?
Not that I was aware of. I was a city and a regional councillor before the end of 22. And we weren't hearing a lot of noise. I think people were still trying to wrap their heads around the issues. We've seen in St. Catharines, like we've watched our vacancy rate get smaller and smaller and smaller, starting about 2016, when we went through, we always consider 3% vacancy rate is sort of the threshold.
Right.
If you have more than that vacancy, you can take old rental buildings and turn them into condominiums. You're allowed to do a condo conversion. At 3%, you're not allowed to do that anymore.
I see. So 3%. Why is 3% the goal? Is that just the standard?
You know what? Smarter people than me would be able to answer it. That was what I was always told. 2016 is when we went below 3%. We've never come back. I joke, like, we have essentially a zero vacancy rate at this point. Like, it's
in St. Catharines.
In St. Catharines. It's very hard. And it's been like that for a number of years. So we were seeing the actual effects on the ground of what the housing crisis looked like. I can tell you, like, housing prices until 5 years ago were still very reasonable in St. Catharines and throughout Niagara, but we saw ridiculous growth in housing prices, especially through the pandemic. When people were trying to get out of the cities, you know, and we saw people moving away from Toronto, our housing prices in this community skyrocketed.
It went high. I'm curious. So on January 17th, I have here, you got confirmation that the HAF funding was coming to you guys, $27.5 million.
Yeah.
How significant? Real quick, how significant is that for a city like us?
I hate to use the word game changer because it's overplayed, but it actually is a game changer for us. It's allowing us to do things that my council never would have agreed to do if we were using property tax.
I see.
But because we have dollars from outside, we can try some different things. Because the money's very specifically, it's not for the core competencies. Like, we can't take that money and spend it on, you know, maintaining the arenas. It has to go towards housing-focused programs. So those housing-focused programs that we would have been reticent to try in the past, we didn't have the money for it. well, now we have money that's specifically for it.
And you can be way more innovative as well.
And that's exactly it. We've got a municipal development corporation. We've talked about it for a couple of years. We're finally bringing that on stream now because we have the dollars to spend. And we can fund it appropriately, which means it's going to be able to do the land acquisition that it needs to do. And we're hoping that it's going to be able to start seeing units built. And that's ultimately, that's the goal of all these dollars.
Okay, so one thing I was trying to find online, and oh my God, I could not find this. How do you receive the money? Like, is it a one-time check? Is it in phases? Have you received it technically yet? I've heard that it's not being released till 2025. Is that...
So it's being released in chunks, 4 tranches of money. Municipalities are guaranteed the first 3. They'll last over the course of 4 years. That 4th year only comes about if you're hitting your targets. So we had to set housing targets.
Really?
Yeah. So
wow.
You have to show progress towards your targets to be able to get that last year of funding. But we're pretty confident we're going to be able to do that. I mean, the reality that doesn't get talked a lot about, but the reality is if you want to hit those targets, you have to have development applications coming in as well. And we're seeing more development activity.
You are?
Yeah, we're seeing more activity now with developers working through the process. I can tell you in our downtown, we approved a build which is hopefully going to start before the end of this year across the street. But there are 3 or 4 more towers proposed that are in various stages of the process right now, going through the planning approval stage, working with engineering and everything else. We're confident that we're going to continue to see those projects coming forward, and we're hearing for interest in other parts of the city. We just approved last week, 500 plus units at a major intersection.
Right on Scott Street there.
Yeah, Scott and Geneva, and former Central Church. It's a vacant parking lot. I tell people that was literally the kind of project I ran my campaign on, saying, listen, we have these parking lots across the city. Let's use them for high-density residential. Right. In this case, it's high-density residential next to high-density residential. It's got a massive park that's about to undergo a redevelopment, in Fairview Park. It's got the Fairview Mall with grocery and everything, a transit terminal.
Well, it will certainly bring more life to the Fairview Mall as well, which is going to, maximize that space too. I'm curious. So on the point of, the policies and the plans that you guys are enacting, there's one interesting thing that I did some research on. It's the Planning and Building Affordable Housing Fee Reimbursement Policy.
Yes.
I want to understand that a little bit more. Can you break that down for me? Simplify it for my generation.
So it's very much about those affordable units. When nonprofits come forward, we've had a couple of instances the last few years, nonprofit groups coming forward saying, listen, we want to build affordable housing, right? So we put in place this program to standardize the process because when that happens, council wants to help. We don't actually, the city's not involved in building affordable housing. That's a regional responsibility. But when groups come forward and want to do that, well, we want to help them somehow. So we would be doing one-off fee waivers and grants to allow them to not pay their planning fees. Staff standardized it and made it more straightforward for us. So it's geared towards nonprofits. It's all about purpose-built rental. And basically the idea is, that if enough units meet that affordability criteria, which we consider to be 30% of income, then they're eligible for those waivers. And it standardizes the process so that we're not doing these one-offs.
So is this not effective for builders? Like, do developers, like for-profit developers, are they under this?
So for-profit developers, I don't think qualify for this, but for-profit developers can still apply for our community improvement program grants, which can provide big tax incentives if they're providing affordable housing units.
Well, so one of my questions was the 30% on new dwelling units has to be considered affordable. I mean, the word affordable is very subjective. I think we can both agree on that. Yeah. How is St. Catharines specifically defining affordable?
So we use the regional definition, which is 30% of the annual income, or below the market rent, whichever one is the lowest.
How much below?
So it just has to be below the market rent at that time.
I see.
And if it falls, whichever one is the least, that's the one we go with.
Oh, I see. So let's say average rent in St. Catharines, don't quote me, is $2,000. If they're building units that, have rents at $2,500 for nicer units, $2,250, then the ones, as long as they have 30% of, let's say, $1,750 or $1,850, then they could qualify for certain grants.
They could qualify for, yeah.
I see. And so are you seeing any pushback from developers? I mean, obviously we have rates are high right now, which a lot of developers are frustrated with. Are you seeing pushback from developers solely based on rates, or is there anything else that you're hearing concern-wise?
Well, the biggest issue that I hear from developers really comes down to interest rates. Like it's very much, trying to go through the pre-sale process is very difficult because the market's cooled considerably. And I tell people, go to bed every night praying for a rate cut because that will make things better. But that's also impacting the supply chain. So building materials are up. And we hear a lot of frustration from the community asking, well, why aren't these developers offering to build affordable units? It's really not feasible right now. Like I keep trying to tell people, unless government is going to subsidize those units or government is going to build those units, you're probably not going to get affordable units.
Will your half plan subsidize some of the units?
They can. Yeah, like the dollars could be used in that way. And we'll use the half money for some form of subsidization, like the permit application fee waiver. But that's probably not the best use of the money either. Like we can make the dollars go a lot further by doing other things.
What?
Well, like the Municipal Development Corporation. So the benefit of an MDC, it takes a lot of the real estate issues out of City Hall. And so it's away from, what people would term the bureaucracy. And it puts it in the hands of an arm's length corporation that's going to be made up of people in the building industry who understand, like, listen, the goals of this corporation are to build affordable housing, attainable housing, and
So I'm just trying to understand here. So you take, let's say, the 10 top builders in St. Catharines who have a proven track record of building homes.
Yep.
You put them into a group, and obviously it's in their best interest to join that. And then from there, they have the opportunity to use land that the city owns, or?
So the corporation is going to have the opportunity to use that land, but the corporation is going to partner with local developers, local construction companies.
So in a sense, they would sell off to the developers?
To a certain extent, but still maintain some control over it by virtue of being a partner in the project.
I see.
So we're able to make back the money that we're investing in that housing and then use those dollars to build further. We have access to this Housing Accelerator Fund money, which allows us to do some of that property acquisition. But we are also, in the process, and we haven't finalized it yet, but the expectation is the city's also going to transfer the vacant lands that the city currently owns to the MDC. The city's going to take surface parking lots and sell the air rights for $1 to this
to the MDC corporation.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
So we're able to seed the company with enough money and land that they can start to make decisions, right? We look around the city, the Garden City Arena complex was taken down last year. It's a grass field now, but that's a site that we know we want to develop. We know we can put hundreds of units on top of it.
So is this in some way, one of the things that I was always curious about, do municipalities have enough capacity to make sure that we're building, how many homes we need to build is an insane amount. It's a very tough goal to hit.
Yep.
It's insanely ambitious and it's going to be very challenging.
Yep.
I can't fathom that a municipality alone has the capacity to do all that. So you're in some way putting the control of more housing units being developed in the developer's hands here in St. Catharines.
In partnership with this third party, which is controlled by the city, but it's not a city department. And so the idea is, you need to be kind of nimble and flexible when you're working in the development industry. Every developer I talk to says that. You've got to be able to respond to market conditions. You've got to make decisions quickly to be able to take advantage of certain situations. The city's not built like that. Like the city, this is just the reality, and I love it here.
You're right.
But we don't make decisions quickly. So we need this third party to be able to do those things in conjunction with the development industry to try and get these properties developed. And I say, the city's just, our core competency is not land development. It never has been because that was never the purpose of a municipal government. But we're in a situation now where we have to be good at it. And so let's figure out who is good at it and work with them. That's the purpose of the MDC.
I see. No. It's actually this is the first time I'm hearing about it, so it actually seems like a great idea. One of the things, if I can play devil's advocate a little bit, I worked with a few real estate developers and investors, and the idea a few years ago of St. Catharines, from what I had understood, was approvals take forever. Mm-hmm. The board, it drags out, and it's very hard to get a second unit or get your basement converted into a secondary unit. Those are the kinds of things we need right now to solve the affordability crisis, or at least contribute towards solving it. Are you seeing that change here in St. Catharines in the council and approvals?
Yep.
How?
So that was the first step at the provincial level of things that the government started to do. They offered up money, something we call the Streamlined Development Fund, which allowed us to go into planning and building services, figure out where the bottlenecks were, and start to dismantle them, start to open things up. So we've made some headway in that. I came out with a mayor's direction 2 weeks ago now. It's one of the things that the strong mayor powers allow me to do, and it's basically a direction to our senior staff saying housing is our number one priority. So in planning and building services, we've identified a couple of areas where we still had bottlenecks, and we couldn't get the dollars to be able to clear those bottlenecks. Use the Housing Accelerator Fund, put the money into development engineering, put it into the expediter positions, and hire more people to get those jobs filled and then get the process moving quicker. I said to the other departments in the city, like they're going to be asked for comments on different building projects. That's always sort of been a side of the desk function, right? Like the municipal works folks focus on municipal works first. And then if they've got to provide comment to some development application, well, that's your priority now.
Right,
do that
right.
first. Because
so you've really had to shift priorities. Are you seeing, real quick, you obviously have a good network of mayors that you know in the GTA as well. Are you seeing that is starting to become a more common theme as mayors understand we have to start leading in this way and pushing in a direction we have to be more ambitious?
It really depends on the municipality. I mean,
Right.
These are conversations we're all having. I'm not the first mayor to use the strong mayor powers to do something like this. My circumstances are different from Cam Guthrie's up in Guelph or Kevin Davis's in Brantford. So they're not going to have to do the things that I have to do, and I don't have to do what they do. But I have these tools, and if there's something that I can do to try and smooth this process and make it faster, I have to do that. Like we talk about, my council signed a housing pledge last year to the province of 11,000 units. I ran on a campaign of 15,000 units.
Yeah, and that was one of my next questions. I'm glad you brought that up because one of my questions was, you have a pretty ambitious idea of 15,000 units. I mean, this Scott Street development's a great one, and I know that you have others coming up in the loop. But one of my questions is, how are we defining housing? And because I know with the town hall that you held with this new development, you got a lot of pushback from the people that lived in the area around Scott Street there, just because they don't think we can handle it. They don't like it because it's so high density, et cetera. And I think, anybody's going to get that. Anybody's going to have frustrations with that, but that's the reality. We have to do those kinds of things. But are we changing the definition of housing? Like, are bungalows or semi-detached homes not the answer anymore? Are we got to look at more apartments here in St. Catharines?
So I think in general, no, they're not the answer anymore. You can't keep building that way. In St. Catharines specifically, we definitely can't continue building that way because we don't have the land. Like, we have an urban boundary that the province has never changed. So when we were going through all the questions about greenbelt legislation and everything else, the province never made a choice to change our urban boundary. I appreciate that. You've got wine country and specialty crop area to the west. The urban boundary butts up against that. In the south, basically we're running into Thorold, so there's nowhere to grow in the south. And in the east, on the other side of the canal, again, you're into specialty crop area in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Like, our urban boundary is not going anywhere. And
you have a very high population.
And we've got 140,000 people in the city. Yeah. So our options are up or nowhere. There is no out for us. And the reality is that urban sprawl isn't good development either. It doesn't pay for itself. It winds up costing taxpayers way more than it brings in tax revenue. So we're kind of being hamstrung into the kind of development we need anyways. One of the things I ran on, and I still firmly believe this, and we're starting to see some proposals coming forward, is we've got a couple of big shopping centers with huge parking lots. And I've been very clear, like, we don't need to build high density residential units in the middle of low density neighborhoods. Just build them on top of parking lots. Like, you can maintain the public parking, put 2 levels of podium parking, and then go 20 or 30 stories high.
And there's plenty of parking in St. Catharines that's not necessarily being utilized to the best, unless it's full every weekend or,
But also we have 80,000 on-street parking spaces in this city for 140,000 people, plus all the driveways, plus all the parking lots. There's more than enough parking. So again, to that point, if you go to a Smart Center or a Penn Center or the Fairview Mall, maintain the public parking, keep the parking, put a podium on top of it, add some more parking, and then build 20 or 30 stories. There's no neighbors to interfere with. Nobody's going to get upset about shadows in the parking lot.
I think one thing that people are going to care about, and I was thinking about this as I was putting together some questions for you, was, of course, let's talk about this 570 unit? Yeah, 570 unit development that's going to be taking place, and hopefully shovels are in the ground by end of this year on Scott Street. How do you balance the needs as mayor? And I know you don't have so much control over this, as well as immigration. I know you have zero control over that.
Yeah.
But how do you balance the needs of Canadian citizens needing homes, like what's being built in St. Catharines right now on Scott Street, versus immigrants and refugees also needing homes and places to live?
And so I can't control, and a municipality could never control who's going to live in the buildings that are built. I've been very clear all the way through, though, and I'm very pro-immigration. I have some frustrations with the way the system has been allowed to develop over the last couple of years because I don't think the right questions were being asked. If you're going to bring 500,000 or 1 million immigrants into Canada, the question has to be asked, where are they going to live? Like, if you don't have a plan to build housing, then you can't just open the doors and allow everybody to come in. But I also think that Canada needs a robust immigration system because we have social safety nets that have been built that are not sustainable unless we continue to have population growth. And if you just look at the population growth that's happening within our borders from, births versus deaths, not enough people to maintain the social safety net, not enough people to maintain the healthcare system, not enough people to maintain anything that we understand as Canadians.
I believe our birth rate's like 1.3. It's incredibly low.
But this is it. Like, we're not at replacement. So you have to have a robust immigration system. You can't have a robust immigration system if you're not planning for it, though. And I was very fond last year of saying when we were sort of dealing with a refugee crisis in Niagara Falls, a lot of refugees were being sent to Niagara Falls, being put into the hotels, but with no long-term plan of how they were going to be integrated into society.
It's like a Band-Aid.
But also no additional funding. So when they were finished with the refugee system, now they're, with the general population, well, how are we going to pay? They're going to need social services. Are we putting that on the property tax base who currently lives in Niagara to pay for that? Yeah. That's what was happening. You can't have the happy headlines if you're not willing to cut the check.
Can you do anything to push or motivate as mayor to watch Canadians live in those apartment units?
I have done everything in my power, and I've had these conversations with federal ministers and I've had these conversations with provincial ministers on the things I think they need to be doing to allow us to have a more equitable community for everybody.
Yeah.
I will keep advocating, but at the end of the day,
there's only so much.
And there's no levers that we have to pull, right? All I can do is try and educate my community of what's going on and get them to contact their members of parliament and provincial parliament and try and move the needle.
One other question I had, and then I want to jump over to the homelessness going on here in St. Catharines and what we can do to do that. You have some really innovative solutions on that. Last question, though, is around transportation. Mm-hmm. So St. Catharines, and my office is in St. Catharines on 4th Avenue, so I know the streets quite well. It's getting busier. It's getting pretty busy.
Yeah.
Now that you have, for example, this project going on right now with 570, new people or plus, I can imagine that it's a couple or families living in those units. How do you make sure that we have enough road space to transfer this flow of traffic?
So we've been lucky that our roads have been largely overbuilt for the population that we have over the last 75 years. So the reality is we have quite a bit of traffic capacity. When we have proposals like this, we always, we make the developers come forward with their traffic information. So what are the current traffic flows in the neighborhood? Because we'll do roadworks if we think that they're necessary around new developments.
To support the new development.
To support the new development. But it's a matter of, okay, is it necessary or is it just a perception?
Is that necessary for the Scott Street one?
No. I've been through that intersection. I go through that intersection a couple times a week at rush hour and not rush hour. And the reality is it's in significantly better shape from a traffic volume perspective than a lot of other parts of the city. Like, I would wager that 4th Avenue, where it meets Ontario Street and Welland,
4th Ave is packed,
it has a lot more volume at any time of day.
Could half funding be used to...
No.
It can't be used.
No,
but what if you go and build an apartment building that's 1,000 units, and obviously you're going to need more road space for that? Where do you...
So the Housing Accelerator Fund is not to be used for infrastructure. Now, we also receive gas tax funding from the feds, so we can then tie our gas tax funding towards that, which we don't call it that anymore. It's called the Canadian Community Benefit or something like that. They changed the name, but it's gas tax. We could use those dollars for it, but half is very specific in what they want us to use it for, and that's not one of the things. But I understand that. Like, it's not the biggest bang you could get for those dollars, so those dollars are better spent in other ways. That said, if we see a need, we'll make the changes. In this case, it really comes down to a perception versus a reality sort of situation. And I've told people, like, at the end of the day, I can get from Port Weller in the northeast corner of the city to Club Roma in the southwest corner of the city, and it takes me about 20 minutes.
Yeah, the one thing I will say is 20 minutes is typical, unless there's construction going on.
And this is, you can never help that, but if you can get almost anywhere from anywhere in the city in 20 minutes, we're still not at a point where I would say traffic is bad.
For sure. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to shift over to homelessness, and I don't want to skip over this topic because I know it's important to a lot of people. Bridge housing is something that you talked about. You've explained it a couple times, and you've explained it on other networks as well. Can you just maybe quickly help us understand what it is and what makes it effective?
Yeah. So I learned about this last year when I first came into office. I toured a site in Niagara Falls. They had taken 24 units and turned it into bridge housing. Basically, the idea is they go out into the homeless community and identify the folks that have the highest need for support. They've been homeless the longest. They need the most support to be able to transition into some form of permanent housing. You put them in this building. There's on-site supervision 24/7. People help them, cook their meals and teach them some of the skills that you need to be able to live on your own again. Because if someone's been living on the street or they've been in a tent for the last 10 years, if you pick them up and put them into an apartment, it's probably not going to wind up well. Like we had cases of folks going into these bridge housing units. And they'd been outside so long that the first thing they did was set up their tent in the middle of the room. They didn't know how to sleep anywhere other than in their tent.
Do you find it's a social issue, or is it a affordability crisis issue?
Well, it probably started out as an affordability piece, and it becomes a socialization piece at that point. The bridge housing exists to help people, learn those skills and get connected to the supports that they need in the community, so that when they transition into some form of permanent housing, whether it's supportive housing or whether it's on their own in an apartment, that they're able and they have the supports they need to be able to thrive in those places and not wind up back on the street. And the program has seen really good success. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of the people they're bringing, and again, these are the folks who've been homeless the longest, are transitioning into full-time shelter in housing that is not, and they're not going back.
Yeah, you've seen it be a huge proponent for success. Well, I think the number one thing is we all have to agree is that, unfortunately, when you don't have a home for an X amount of time, as it goes longer and longer drawn out, it gets harder and harder. And unfortunately, you start leaning on other things that I can't blame people for doing, because it is. I can imagine. I can't fathom that.
But this is, and the flip side of that coin is when people do get, if they develop mental health issues or they have drug addiction issues, a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, they got to get themselves clean and fixed up before we put them in housing. Well, I mean, if you're living on the street, you might only be getting 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night.
Yeah.
I know if I get one night of 2 or 3 hours of sleep, I'm useless the next day.
Yeah.
But we're saying to you, those folks, okay, fix all of your mental health issues and stop it with the drugs. That's not a reasonable...
You have to properly teach them. I'm curious, I want to touch on Positive Living Niagara, because that is one element that has been a huge debate federally, but then we also, of course, see Positive Living Niagara here in St. Catharines. Why do you feel like that's a part of the solution?
I think ultimately you can't save people if they die. And I think there's a lot of other work that needs to be done. I will say I'm very frustrated. I think we've done a good job on harm reduction. Or I shouldn't say, we've done a lot of work on harm reduction. Some of it has been very positive. We know that there are some negatives that come along with it as well, like the diversion of safe supply. But harm reduction is only one part of trying to deal with the drug crisis. There needs to actually be prevention. There needs to be drug rehabilitation, and we're not doing a very good job in those areas. If I have someone who shows up at our safe consumption site and uses, but then says to one of the workers, you know what, I've decided this is rock bottom, I need to get clean. It's almost impossible to get that person into a rehabilitation bed quickly. Really? It's anywhere from 9 to 12 weeks.
So can I ask you a question just for sake of time? I want to
Sure.
make an assumption here. Do you think we won't see as many Positive Living Niagaras pop up more, and instead you're looking at more bridge housing and options like that to rehabilitate people?
If we're not doing the other pieces of the puzzle, then we're keeping people alive, and that's great, but we're also just continuing.
It's pointless if you don't have the rehabilitation.
Listen, saving a life is never pointless, but if you're not helping people get off the drugs, then you're just going to be throwing more money at the problem, and you're not going to be getting the results. Ultimately, the whole point of this was to try and get people off of drugs. You want to keep them alive until you can get them clean. Well, we're keeping them alive, but we're not giving them any help to get clean.
So you kind of have a fair balance. That actually seems like it's a very viable answer. I mean, it seems like you have a decent balance.
I think I'm where most Canadians are. We know if someone's turned to drugs, they're hooked on opioids, whatever they might be, bad stuff happened in that life, and you don't want to throw that away. That's a human being. They can't help what happened to them. You got to give them the help and keep them alive, but you also have to offer them the services they need to get clean, because it's not an effort issue. Like, as someone who's dealt with, like, I'm a recovering alcoholic.
Yeah.
As someone who's dealt with addiction issues, like, it's not as easy as, oh, well, just fix yourself. Like, that's not how it works. And we know that. And most people that I talk to recognize that. You've gotta help people, but you can't just keeping them alive. Like, you're only doing half the job. So let's finish the job.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. But if you don't have the spaces like Positive Living Niagara and you only have the bridge housing, in some ways that's useless.
Well, because they may not survive to ever get to there. Right?
Okay, so last thing I want to ask you, but I really wanted to get to this, was the area where St. Catharines General Hospital used to be, and then of course it's torn down now. So there's a lot of space there, it seems, and it seems like there's a lot of potential in that area, but unfortunately, it's not the safest area. And I think, do you find that that's probably the biggest area for, where drug addiction starts and where people live on the streets in St. Catharines?
It's definitely where a lot of despair in our community is concentrated. So right now the property is in the process of being, I'm hoping, resold. We've never owned that site. It was owned by the Niagara Health System. They sold it to private developers. It's sort of changed hands. It went into foreclosure. We're hoping that it's going to be purchased. We're at the table and ready with whatever developer comes forward with a viable plan. We would love to see high density purpose-built rental on that site.
But why would they build there if, I mean, you've driven through the area.
100%. But I mean, a lot of the despair that's there is because of that site being basically abandoned. Like, I mean, we can tie a lot of the issues that occur in the area back to when the hospital moved. The site was taken down, but not all the way, and then it just sat in limbo, and things have gotten worse over the years.
I know there's tunnels under that space as well, which probably makes it, I've heard that. I know that probably makes it harder to develop, but do you feel like there's a two-prong approach where the city has to get in that area and help with the drug addiction?
So we're not sitting back. Like, right now we're putting together plans on how we're going to deal with a lot of the issues we can have some control over, right? Like, there's a lot of property standards issues in the area. You know, we know that there are folks that are not keeping up their properties. They're allowing certain things to happen on their properties that they shouldn't be. So we're in the process of putting together our plans on how we're dealing with that. We will be at the table with whoever purchases that site to make the neighborhood better for the people who live there, and to try and help the people who are in the neighborhood who need the help. But at the end of the day, we need a private developer to come on that site as well. And like I said,
the city can't go build 1,000 units.
Well, and this is, to be blunt, I'm hopeful that they're thinking higher than that too. I think you could put, 1,500, 2,000 purpose-built rentals.
It's a huge space. And I remember driving by there, and that came to me when I wanted to ask you. I was like, well, when you talk about space, and I was thinking space, I'm thinking St. Catharines General Hospital.
Yeah.
But I also know that it can be complicated. That's all the time we have, and I know you have a very swamped schedule, and I know you're a very busy man. But thank you so much for joining me and sitting down with our generation. Of course, I'm only 20, so to get these kind of answers to these questions is really valuable to us and to see what's happening in St. Catharines. So
happy to, man, anytime.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Enjoy.